power, wealth, and the new colonialism, resources, regime change, and the shadow economy. The politics of natural resources, oil, gold, and critical minerals, have always shaped international power. In the 21st century, the struggle for control over those resources has acquired new forms. Sanctions, clandestine barter networks, and, critics warn, an emergent neo-colonialist posture in which military superiority and economic coercion are reused as tools to access energy and strategic minerals. Under this view, the Trump era represents a renewed willingness to combine overt military threat projection with economic pressure, a modern parallel to practices described by John Perkins in Confessions of an Economic Hitman and to Cold War covert operations that the U.S. intelligence community has since publicly acknowledged. From classical coups to modern coercion, historical precedents. The United States' history of intervention to secure strategic resources and geopolitical influence is well documented. In the mid-20th century, covert operations engineered or supported regime change in several countries where control over resources and political orientation were at stake. Declassified records show U.S. involvement in the 1953 overthrow of Iran's Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, a crisis triggered after Mossadegh nationalized Anglo-Iranian oil, and CIA files document activities around the 1954 Guatemala coup that removed Jacobo Arbenz. These episodes became touchstones in debates about sovereignty, resource politics, and covert action. AP News. Those historical precedents help explain why modern analysts deploy the language of economic hitmen and resource wars when describing how powerful states and multinational actors exert pressure on resource-rich but institutionally fragile countries. The economic hitman thesis, influenced by debt and the World Bank/IMF model. John Perkins' Confessions of an Economic Hitman and his later editions popularized a model in which consultants, multilateral lenders, and state actors induced developing countries to accept large loans for infrastructure and extractive projects. According to Perkins, these indebted nations then see political autonomy erode as their debts and obligations swaddle local elites and foreign corporations. Perkins' account, widely read and influential, is disputed by some scholars as a literal, consistent blueprint, yet it remains an important interpretive lens for understanding how debt, institutions such as the IMF and World Bank, and corporate interests can be marshaled to extract resources and influence policy. In the public imagination, the economic hitman is the bureaucratic complement to overt military pressure, financial entrapment rather than, or in addition to, kinetic force. Wikipedia. Trump, military posturing, and resource geopolitics. Critics argue that a new form of coercion, call it neo-colonial in style, reappeared during the Trump presidency. Assertive military rhetoric, public threats of force, and policy measures aimed at securing access to resources deemed critical for national power. Multiple reports documented that President Trump publicly suggested the military option for Venezuela and repeatedly raised the possibility of intervention in high-level discussions, an escalation that alarmed aides and regional partners. This kind of rhetoric, analysts contend, signals to resource-rich but weak states that political independence will be costly if they resist U.S. interests. The Guardian. More recently, U.S. policy placed unusual emphasis on securing critical minerals and rare earth supplies, resources central to advanced technologies and energy transitions. Executive orders and strategic guidance during the period highlighted a push to secure domestic and allied supply chains for minerals like lithium, cobalt, and rare earths, raising the stakes in geopolitics over resource access and control. Observers worry that such imperatives can combine with military power into coercive statecraft aimed at less militarily capable but resource-rich states. Atlantic Council. Venezuela and Turkey, a case study in resource-driven alliances and sanctions evasion. The Venezuela-Turkey relationship, described earlier in this essay, illustrates how authoritarian regimes adapt to pressure by creating alternative trade corridors and barter arrangements to monetize key assets. Reports and trade data documented large flows of Venezuelan gold to Turkey from 2017 to 2019, a commercial pattern that helped Caracas raise foreign exchange outside conventional banking channels while avoiding sanctions. The alliance demonstrates how resources can be converted into geopolitical resilience. Gold shipments, food deals, and discrete financial networks can sustain regimes under sanction pressure. Military times. This pattern also shows how extra-state actors, criminal networks, corrupt officials, and unscrupulous middlemen flourish where formal markets are closed. Critics argue that such arrangements can feed transnational organized crime and deepen state capture, turning national resource wealth into patronage and repression rather than public goods. When debt, coercion, and the shadow economy collide. The historical record suggests three recurring mechanisms through which powerful states or their proxies secure resource access. Economic leverage, loans, conditional aid, and multilateral finance can tie recipient states to creditor agendas, the debt dependency model described by Perkins and others. Wikipedia. Covert action and intervention. The CIA-backed coups of the mid-20th century illustrate how covert operations have been used to topple governments that challenge strategic interests. Declassified documents confirm several such interventions. AP News. Sanctions plus alternative alliances. Modern sanctions aim to isolate regimes. In response, authoritarian governments develop alternative trade routes and alliances, with states or private networks willing to trade in excluded assets, gold, narcotics, barter shipments. The Venezuela-Turkey case is a concrete example. Military times. When combined, these mechanisms create a cycle. Coercion, economic or military, invites sanctioning and isolation, which in turn incentivizes shadow market solutions that entrench informal power and criminalize state revenue sources. Ethical and strategic consequences. The return to a posture that leverages military superiority and economic coercion to secure resources carries heavy costs. Moral hazard. Threatening or using force against weaker states in the name of resource security undermines norms of sovereignty and breeds resentment. Blowback and instability. Covert interference or overt threats can produce long-term instability that damages global supply chains and creates humanitarian crises. Criminalization of the state. When regimes monetize resources outside law, corruption and organized crime deepen, undermining governance and development. Legitimacy deficit for multilateral institutions. Using IMF or World Bank mechanisms as instruments of geopolitical pressure delegitimize those institutions and fuels nationalist backlash. This is why careful, multilateral approaches that combine transparency, legal enforcement, and development, rather than unilateral coercion, are often recommended by internationalists and many policy experts. Making distinctions. Allegation versus proven fact. Two cautions are necessary. First, while John Perkins' economic hitman thesis captures an influential narrative about resource-driven influence, some of its claims are disputed by scholars and require careful empirical corroboration. Second, allegations of organized crime pipelines and specific assassination plots require rigorous, document-based proof. In the Cold War era, however, the historical record does include clear cases where U.S. covert action helped overthrow governments accused of threatening strategic resource interests. Declassified archives confirm several of those operations. Readers should therefore weigh the spectrum of evidence, from confirmed declassified operations to contested contemporary allegations, when drawing conclusions. Wikipedia. Conclusion. Toward a more transparent policy. The interplay of resource wealth, state coercion, and shadow economics is hardly new, but the 21st century's strategic minerals, energy transitions, and multipolar alliances have renewed the stakes. If the United States or any great power resorts to unilateral military threats or economic coercion as a primary tool for securing resources, it risks repeating the worst patterns of a bygone imperial age, with added volatility produced by modern global markets and transnational crime. A robust response requires more than saber-rattling. It demands multilateral coordination for resource security, transparent financial systems to block illicit monetization, and legal accountability for transnational criminal networks that traffic in goods and influence. Without such systems, the cycle of coercion, sanction, and shadow trade will continue, and with it the prospect of a new, dangerous iteration of colonial-style resource politics. Selected sources and further reading. Reporting on U.S. threats against Venezuela and internal White House discussions. The Guardian, Axios, Military Times. The Guardian, Axios. On Venezuela, Turkey gold flows and barter arrangements. Reuters, Wilson Center Analysis. Military Times. John Perkins, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, Popular Account and Critiques. Wikipedia. Declassified CIA documents and reporting on historical coups. Iran 1953, Guatemala 1954 National Security Archive, CIA Reading Room, AP reporting. NSArchive 2.gwu.edu. CIA. On critical minerals and recent U.S. policy, executive orders and analyses. Atlantic Council, policy briefings. Atlantic Council.